Alright, these are Markduino boards. I built these two based on the parts list online. You can order the circuit boards from a company called OSH Park. And then there's a parts list of all the parts that you need to solder on. You can also buy these pre-made on the Astromech forums. There's usually somebody selling them on there so that you don't have to make them. You will save money by making them yourself, but it is quite a bit of soldering. Some of it's fairly close together, so if you're not really comfortable with your soldering skills, you do have the option to buy them. Notice also that I have a set of master and slave, and up here I have master, slave, and another master that's a V3. These I made in, I think, 2020. And if you flip the circuit board over, they say revision 1.5.2, April 5th, 2016. Version 3 says version 1.5, revision 3, July 4th, 2020. The boards are the same size. They use the same components, although this one has an extra LED and resistor for that LED. And they use different firmware. And this one also has an additional screw down connector for voltage and ground, whereas this one only has one. The pins have been rearranged, and there's additional features in this firmware, which I won't go into, but just to know that there's V2, which is the one that's been used for quite a few years, and then there's the new version, relatively new version 3, which I decided to buy some circuit boards and make revision 3. I'm thinking now maybe that wasn't the smartest idea. There's custom code out there that people have made for the version 2s, and yet I don't think that many people are modifying the version 3 yet. So if you want to just go with the stock setup of what these Markduinos do for your Shadow MD system, then version 3 is probably fine. It adds some extra features. But if you really want to get into these where you're reprogramming them, setting up new sequences, opening certain panels and playing certain sounds at the press of one button would be a sequence. If you want to alter the code, then maybe V2 would be better, because there's just more information about V2. It's been out there for a while and more people have modified it, whereas, like I said, the V3 are fairly new. Now, and I'm kicking myself because I ordered enough parts to build 3 of these, but I didn't order one of the older boards to build a third one of these. The master and slave go in your dome typically, and they control the TSIS lights, the holo projectors. They send commands to the MP3 trigger to play audio files. And then a second master can be put in the body to control servos in the body. And now I've got a full set of version 3, but I'm one master short of having a full set of version 2. So I probably should have got the parts to make another version 2 just so I would have 2 complete sets. But this is what I have at the moment. Now, I made these in, like I said, I think 2020, but I never programmed them. So just recently I bought the SparkFun Pocket AVR programmer that you use to program these Markduino boards. I got this one off Amazon simply because I went to the SparkFun site. The board is a little bit cheaper on their site, but they wanted $10 shipping, so I went to Amazon, and even though the board was a little bit more with free shipping, the end total came out a little bit less. So this USB obviously goes into your computer, and then this cable comes with it, and it plugs into your Markduino. Now that's something you need to get right. You look for the header that is labeled ISP. Of course, it's upside down there. So if you can see it in there, there's a little text that says ISP, and there's this 6-pin header here. And the most important thing is, if you look in this corner, there's that white box type shape in the corner. That's denoting that this is pin 1. Now, why they didn't just put a number 1 on the board in print, I don't know. Maybe you can't print things that close to a hole in the board, this mounting hole. It would have made it a little bit easier, but you can still see when you've got these headers installed the white outline there telling you that's pin 1. This programmer cable, usually when you have things with ribbon cables and they have a red cable denotes pin 1. That is not the case here, because you can see this red cable goes into the middle of this connector. So the way to find pin 1 on this connector is to look at the back side here, and right by my thumbnail there, hopefully you can see there's a really tiny arrow. That is pointing to pin 1. So pin 1 is on the side of this cable that has this notch in it, and the arrow is on that side. So that means that this, where'd my board go, plugs into the header like that. So my pin 1 indicator is there, and underneath this ribbon cable, pin 1 indicator is on that side. Something that I saw on Curious Mark's website that I think he did that might be a good idea is use a Sharpie and color this end wire. And so that way when you pick your programmer up, if you are forgetful and don't remember which side is pin 1, because this will fit either this way or going off this way, just mark it with a Sharpie, and then you'll know that's pin 1, and then look at your board for that little white marking denoting pin 1, and you'll get it on the right way. I'm probably not going to bother doing that, because all of these boards, even though the version 3 are slightly different arrangement, the programmer cable goes away from the board. It doesn't go across the board, so that's easy enough for me to remember. I don't think I'll bother marking that end, but you could do that to help you remember which side is pin 1. So that leaves you with your board, programming board, plugged in to your Markduino, which has a chip on it that should be blank, so there's no code running on this board. And you need to program it. So you can find, on Curious Mark's webpage, you can find the firmware. Also, MarcDuino.com is a new site, and I believe they are trying to move all of the Markduino information over there, so it might not always be on the Curious Mark site. I'm not sure if that's completely true, but there is now a MarcDuino.com site which is being maintained that has in the process of having all this content moved over to it. So from this page, it's got instructions on how to install. It's got links to the software depending on the board you're using. It tells you about the programmer, how to install the drivers for the programmer, and to download AVRDUDESS if you're doing this on Windows. How to connect it, and this is an older version of the Markduino board, but it's similar. You've got your PC plugged into the programmer, and like I showed, the programmer then plugs into the Markduino board. And it tells you how to upload the firmware using AVRDUDESS, including what settings to use. So if I go over to AVRDUDESS, here you see it looks different than Curious Mark's example because, well, Curious Mark's example is older than this current version of the firmware, or of the AVRDUDESS GUI interface. So you can still figure out you need the path to where your firmware is, and up here you need to set what your programmer is, and over here you set the chip that's on your board, ZAT Mega 328P, and then you get down to the fuses, which are very important. There's a low fuse, a high fuse, an extended fuse, and then this one is not used. Now, if you'll notice here, my settings are different than what I'm going to show you on Curious Mark's site. My extended fuse, for example, is 0xFC, and if we go to Curious Mark's site, 0x07 is what he shows. So that caused me some confusion. I used the values here from Mark's page because it was the tutorial I was following that tells you how to set up the programmer and everything else. So I used these fuses and plugged the information in like he shows. And like his page, it writes the firmware to the chip, it verifies the firmware to the chip, and then it writes and verifies the fuses. Unfortunately, I got an error. So if we go over to astromech.net, I am not the only one with this error. Right there, AVRDUDESS verification error. So basically it's expecting 0x07 is what the fuse is set in AVRDUDESS. So it's trying to set the fuse to that, but it failed. And it's currently 0xFF. So that extended fuse didn't set. And Michael Badley's Facebook page has users with this same issue. And the Astromech forums have users with this same issue. And there's not a lot that people can explain how to fix it. You get answers like this where people use AVRDUDE on a Mac and they don't have any problems. But for Windows, using AVRDUDESS, it seems to be an issue. Now, I'm not sure if the issue is AVRDUDESS or is the fact that this information on this extended fuse is from Curious Mark's old instructions. And if you go to the top of this thread on astromech.net, which is the Markduino version 3 support thread, which tells you about the version 3, some things that it can do that version 2 can't, and it gets to uploading the firmware, and it tells you, ensure the fuses are set as noted here. And these are different than the Curious Mark page. But these are in the version 3 thread, so I wasn't sure. It seemed to me that these are only good for version 3. The truth is, and if you do more research, you'll find this, these fuse settings are now good for version 2 and version 3 firmware. So these are the ones that you should be using. So that might be why they're failing, is because people are using the old settings from the Curious Mark website, or it might be the AVRDUDESS graphic user interface. Now, when you install AVRDUDESS in Windows, it throws it into your C drive, program files x86, and then a directory called AVRDUDESS. If you go there, you will see AVRDUDESS. So I believe AVRDUDESS is just the graphic user interface that makes it more friendly to program than AVRDUDE, which is command line driven. And I won't go into that, but you can open up a DOS window in Windows, change directory to the AVRDUDESS directory, type AVRDUDE space and then manual commands, and install the firmware and the fuses manually using this, bypassing the graphic interface. I honestly can't remember because I programmed so many things in the past 3 days. I want to say that I did that and successfully set that extended fuse. I went into a DOS window, went to this directory, and manually typed the command, which you can find online, the command to set fuses on this chip. It's somewhere in here. Somewhere in this thread, I know there's instructions for how to do that on the command line. So you can try that. But again, don't use the Curious Mark fuse settings, because evidently these are no longer valid. Use the ones that are on the V3 support page on Astromech, which I have over here. So here they are. Low 0xFF, high 0xD7, E extended fuse 0xFC, and they work for version 2 or version 3. So I reset those to these values from the old values, and I reprogrammed my version 2 Markduino that had that error message for that extended fuse not being set properly, and it set it. It set all 3 fuses. It reflashed the firmware, and it set all 3 fuses with no issue. So if you use the new fuse values and AVRDUDESS, I think you'll probably be fine. But if you want to use Curious Mark's old fuse settings, then I believe you have to set that. You might have to set that extended fuse using the command line, the AVRDUDE space, and then the command to set that fuse. But again, I wouldn't do that. I would go ahead and use the ones that are listed on that I just showed you, because they work on the version 2 and the version 3. Now, the way that you'll determine once you've run that program and you flash your firmware to know that your firmware is working is you'll see the green light flash once per second. The red light should be steady on. That's telling you you've got power to this board. And the green light should be flashing on and off once a second. And what that means is the code on this chip is running. This Markduino, it will be a functional Markduino, and part of the code is to just flash that LED once per second as a visual indicator that your board is running. So if you've got this in your droid and you look in there and you see that green light flashing, but you're trying to operate R2 and things aren't working right, if that is flashing once per second, at least you know that this board is running. So maybe your problem is somewhere else. So it's a visual indicator. So once you flash it, it should start blinking. And then you know that you're okay. But like I said, it was flashing when I had that error on that extended fuse. It was still flashing. So the chip was still working, running code, but that last fuse wasn't set. So there are posts that say, you're fine. Your code is running, so you should be fine. Well, doing a little more research, the extended fuse is brownout protection for the EEPROM. So this chip stores settings. And evidently, if that extended fuse is not set, then if your battery's current drops low in this board, instead of getting 5 volts, maybe the voltage starts to drop off, it might erase the settings in the chip. At least that's what I understand from the research I did. So you do want that extended fuse to be set, because this board may run and you may never have that problem where you lose your settings, but why take the chance? So try and make sure that you get that extended fuse to work. And like I said, I used the AVRDUDESS, so I followed all of Curious Mark's old instructions right up to the point of the fuses, and I made the fuses match the astromech.net instructions for the version 3 firmware, and used those fuse values, and it works for version 2. And if you, like I said, if you do more research, you'll find that that's the new standard fuse setting for version 2 or version 3. So just something, when I'm making these videos, something that takes a little bit of research, that if you've got this information in one spot, maybe it'll help you avoid some frustration trying to figure out what's going on and how to fix it. Because yeah, like I said, it's a fairly common issue that people have, it looks like, when they program these boards, is that verification of the efuse where it doesn't get set, and not a lot of people with a solution. The main solution is, well, try it on a Mac, because it tends to work better on a Mac using the command line. So try using the V3 fuses, and if that doesn't work, you can run the command line in Windows. You just have to open a DOS window and change to that directory, and then you can type in the AVRDUDE space and then the command to set the fuse in the command line if AVRDUDESS doesn't want to work, and you should be fine there. So I think that's it. I think that's my story of my 5 Markduino boards. And as per my other videos, I've got my Wi-Fi chip now set. I've got my Arduino 2560 set and programmed. So at this point, my next step is the nervous one, where I would like to connect my Wi-Fi chip to the Markduino, connect the Markduino to the Arduino Mega 2560, connect the MP3 trigger, power things up, also an amplifier and speakers, and that will be the first real test to see if I can wake R2 up by simply getting him to play a sound by either using the controllers, which I just bought this off eBay, about 20 bucks for a genuine PlayStation controller. The reason I got the PlayStation branded one is where these things slot in. I guess some aftermarket ones I've read are made specifically keyed so that one of these controllers fits in one side and one of the controllers that has the ball on top fits in the other side, whereas the Sony one, you can plug 2 of these in at the same time and charge them. So I should be able to play sounds by using these, because these are paired with my Arduino Mega 2560. or I should be able to use the R2 Touch app on my phone by connecting to the Wi-Fi ESP8266, or yeah, and send commands through that to play sounds. But that's the next step that I am really nervous about, because now we're talking about supplying power to boards and connecting things to the right pins and hoping there's no magic smoke and you burn something out. So I need to take a break. So I'm not sure. Hopefully this week I might get that set up, but it means I have to figure out how I'm going to power all the stuff, and if I'm going to start working on a board to mount things, or just put them on a piece of wood and rough wire everything in just to make sure it's working before I even start worrying about creating an electronics board to arrange things. But that'll be the next step, is the actual first test to wake R2 up and see if he'll talk to me.